lay down. Go. Sorry.
My cat also waited until the last second to demand to get in. Like, they know you're going to record, so there they are.
We're already recording. This is the best intro ever. All right, y'all. Thank you for tuning in to Dixieland the Proletariat. We're going to talk about Southern working class history and current events from a leftist perspective. Make sure to like us on social media at Dixieland the Proletariat or Dixie Prol. If you want to give your wages to a bunch of rednecks, then subscribe to our Patreon page at patreon.com/DixieProl. Got a lot of cool stuff to give you, including CDs, stickers, and a cookbook. We also have a Spotify playlist with some great artists you also check out. This podcast is brought to you by Newport 100s in a Box, Camel Silver's Black Coffee, Boxed Wine, Friendsgiving, and the fact that all our white listeners are 164 Cherokee on their grandma's side. It's going to be one of those episodes. Shout out to our new Patreon subscribers, Eli, Peter, Jared, and Holly. Our monthly Patreon surplus goes to groups that are run by and or help marginalized people directly. As always, I'm Nelson with...
Comrade Kate.
And... Tommy's
Fuck you, Tommy. Tommy, just get your fucking shit together.
Look, I literally just plugged in my mic. I was going to speak before I was rudely interrupted. Hi, I'm Tommy.
And our guests this evening are...
I'm Kiaza, and I'm here with my sister.
Hi, that's me. I'm Ava.
Woo! And this episode's about how white people fucking suck.
Yes.
Every time I come here, I'm just yelling at white people now.
Like, all of our episodes are about how much white people suck, though. Like, that's... You did nothing to set up what we're going to talk about, like, at all.
The only thing, I swear, the listeners are going to start getting sick of me because I've been here 3 times now. Every time I'm going to yell at white people. This
for
time
a year after this. I mean, like, no, like, you've reached, like, your cap on how many times you can be on the show.
You punched your card too many times. We're
doozy. Yeah, if you come on a 4th time, we have to start paying you benefits. And is it?
I'm one of the Patreon subscribers. I am paying you.
As an anti-union shop, we can't allow that to happen. So we're going to cut your hours.
Oh my god.
Oh my god. Okay.
I'm having flashbacks to when I used to work for the parks in Florida. Shit.
Jesus.
Anyway, rolling on. What you doing back here, Kyle? What you doing around here, Ava? What you going to tell us about today?
Woo!
Oh, we're gonna have fun.
So Ava and I came up with a thing, and what we're primarily going to be discussing tonight is what it's like to be an indigenous person during the season of fall in North America.
Which sucks.
Being indigenous in fall in North America sucks.
That makes me really sad for you because as a white woman, it's the best season. I get to dress like Han Solo and drink pumpkin spice lattes.
Look. Time out. I love pumpkin spice lattes. I don't care who knows it. PSL gang, rise up. Woo!
Oh, wait. Let me tell you something. Oh my god, I had something magical the other day. My nephew brought me this pumpkin spice shake from Dairy Queen, and oh my god, it's amazing. You guys need to
yeah, y'all only get the pumpkin spice stuff though. I mean, granted, the spices are from the South Indies basically, but you get the pumpkin from us. So
yep, it's true. And honestly, most of us actually like pumpkin spice too. Yeah.
We're gonna decolonize fucking pumpkin spice lattes, y'all.
No, you can't. It's literally a colonizer construct.
The problem is that during fall, we can't get pumpkin spice lattes and hold the racism. That's the problem with fall.
Also, a lot of us are lactose intolerant. So.
True.
That is true. I suffer from my love.
All day is where I'm at. I'm Jewish. We've had, you spend thousands of years separating meat from dairy, and you can't have dairy anymore. That's just how it works.
It's the Europeans who are the mutants, honestly.
I mean, yes, white skin is the mark of Cain. How many times do I have to tell everybody?
All right. Ava,
let's do the episode.
Shall we start with Columbus Day?
You know what it is?
You shut your face, Nelson.
It's anti-Italian discrimination.
Shut the fuck up and let them do their thing.
God damn. This is always a fucking mess.
It's total chaos.
Y'all shut up. We're going to talk about Columbus Day now, and then we'll ask you about your opinion, since you cannot. I was going to let you bring up being Italian American, but no, you had to start it yourself.
It's true. She told me yesterday.
I actually had people text me saying that complaining about it. I've had people message me on Instagram and just be like, no one cares that Nelson is Italian. Why does he always bring it up? And I was just like, because he's white and he thinks that anything about him is important.
And that's all he has to latch on to.
I know.
So tell us about Columbus Day.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the notes. So Columbus Day is... it's still a federal holiday, which means that there's a closure of non-essential government offices and usually places like post offices and banks. However, there has been a shift towards trying to get Indigenous Peoples Day to be a thing. So Indigenous Peoples Day is officially recognized in Alaska, Hawaii, Maine, New Mexico, Oregon, South Dakota, and Vermont. And it's not a coincidence that those are either very left-leaning states or a lot of Indians in those states, right?
Yep.
If I can tack onto that, some municipalities as well, because my company is based in Nashville, and Nashville, while the state of Tennessee doesn't officially recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, Nashville does. So for completely selfish reasons, I was very much trying to get it declared a company holiday since we're headquartered in Nashville.
Yeah, it's actually 130 cities recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, including, here in Texas, we're very technically red, but we have a few very liberal cities that each year declare it Indigenous Peoples Day. So that's really common.
And also, Alabama and Oklahoma observe both. So good for you, Alabama, I guess.
I'm really shocked at Alabama there.
We did it! Yay!
We're so progressive. We're so progressive.
So progressive.
So when it comes to Columbus Day, there's a lot of reasons why that makes it hell to be Indigenous during that time. For one, you get a lot of excited Italian Americans who like to say it's about Italian heritage and they hate us Italians, and we don't give a fuck.
We don't give a fuck.
I'm not saying anything.
Good. Stay down.
Heel boy.
All right.
A knife just came through the screen and stabbed me.
Look, they don't need to know about my thing with knives, okay?
Also, Nelson, no one cares if you're the victim.
I know. Just bleeding profusely.
Okay. So, it's not a thing about Italian Americans or anything like that. Columbus was literally a murderer and a rapist. Sorry, I should have warned that in the beginning. We're going to be talking about the crimes that he and his crew members committed, which includes rape, murder, torture, dismemberment, exactly. So Ava, why don't you take this? You got it?
Yeah, so Columbus is a very interesting character in history, but we as in the state of the United States, for some reason worships him almost as a hero, although he never stepped foot on any part of land claimed by the United States. That never made sense to me. But what they don't tell you in school is how utterly and ruthlessly violent he was. When he came over, it was not this myth of he came and saw the land and everybody got along and they traded. It wasn't like a Thanksgiving myth thing, but nobody ever really talks about the violence. So when he came over, one of his men, I believe, or at least one, documented the rape and torture of an Indigenous woman. I think the name was Michelle de
Cunha, a noble friend of Columbus.
Yeah, and he tells of a Carib woman given to him by the admiral. When she fought back against his attempted sexual attacks, he took a piece of rope and whipped her soundly. Finally, we came to an agreement in such a manner that I tell you she seemed to have been brought up in a school for harlots. Columbus's ship would eventually sail back to Europe carrying more than 1,000 native slaves. On Hispaniola, a member of Columbus's crew publicly cut off a native's ears to shock others into submission. About 50,000 Indians committed mass suicide rather than comply with the Spanish. And settlers under Columbus sold 9 and 10-year-old girls into slavery. In fact, the area I live in, this wasn't about Columbus in particular, but it was the same. It was the same. What do you call like this? It was following in the same footsteps of tradition. So where I live, there's the Carrizo, and they were the natives here on this part of the Texas Gulf. And when the Spanish landed, the Carrizo to this day will tell you one of their most vivid, violent, like orally passed down stories about the Spanish were that they would, if they refused to convert, the Spanish would cut their feet off. And this is actually something you can see. There's a story a while ago about a Columbus statue, or it wasn't a Columbus statue. It was another conquistador who had his feet, like a native went up there and removed the feet off the statue. So if you see that, that's why they do that.
And another one of the issues that comes out of kind of Columbus Day as a celebration is that people who eventually find out about, oh my God, Columbus was a horrible, horrible person. Consequently, not only to indigenous people once he made it over to that hemisphere, but also to the people that he worked with and the people that he eventually ruled over in Spain. But yeah, once they find that out, they decide, oh, well, who else can we look up to for this holiday? And I don't know if you have seen this, but it's quite common. It comes up every year, is to flip it to some other colonizer or some other Italian American. And that's straight up fucked up, guys.
What's really too interesting about Columbus, just as an extra thing, is that, you know, he was so renowned for his cruelty. It wasn't just like natives were accusing him of this stuff or like his own men were writing about it. Like the actual government over in Europe had to try him and remove him as governor because of how cruel he was.
Yeah, so, he also wrote about it in his own diaries too.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. It's incredibly well documented just how horrible he was. But that just, it's kind of a testament to the strength of American mythology that you are able to completely tear this story, the history from the story away, and make it about Italian American heritage rather than this person who didn't even come to what is currently the United States, didn't do anything great, basically got lost and stole a bunch of people and murdered a bunch of people. So I would recommend, if you are an ally to indigenous people, I hope you are if you're listening to this, don't try to flip it onto some other colonizer. Please back efforts to make it Indigenous Peoples Day, because he specifically targeted indigenous people. And I mean, there's other ways that we can get into this, because we are going to be getting into several other topics on the way down. But when you
as a thing, I just want to say, when you say don't flip it to another colonizer, it's really important for people to understand. There is, when we're talking about this era of people, you know, taking over the Americas, which were already inhabited, they do want to flip it to, like, say that, I don't remember his name, but that one friar, they wanted to change the name for him. Right, because they're like, well, this guy was great. There's no such thing as a great or a good or a worthy colonizer to worship on this day. Like, they were all awful.
That's the word. Like,
yeah,
they were. Worthy is the best word, because if you're looking, if the goal is to colonize, they did a fucking phenomenal job.
They did a phenomenal job. Exactly.
I mean, worthy. Like, this isn't an activity that bears celebration.
Right.
Exactly.
And there's no such that they were all awful in varying degrees, some much more ruthless than others, but all of them were there for the same reason, and that's what matters.
Right. And if you want like an on the ground story when it comes to this kinds of stuff, this past summer, when a lot of statues are being toppled following the murder of George Floyd, and kind of racial justice was on the national conscience at that time, a Minnesota prosecutor charged an indigenous activist with a felony in the toppling of a Christopher Columbus statue at the state capitol grounds during the rally weeks after the death of George Floyd. What's his name? Mike Forcia, a member of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, is charged with criminal damage to property. Forcia, also a Twin Cities American Indian Movement activist, organized the June 10th American Indian Movement rally at the Capitol. This was in Minnesota. This is the same place where George Floyd was murdered. And an indigenous person decided that at this time, while we have racial justice on the national conscience, I'm going to take down this Columbus statue, and ended up being charged with a felony for destruction.
And this wasn't an isolated incident.
This happened all over the country.
Exactly. At the same time, lots of Columbus statues it was all over the news. Like, it wasn't an isolated incident at the time. It was following on the heels of this large wave of racial justice being at the forefront of America's mind for once. You know what I mean?
Right. So in that case, I would leave it on the note of, for Columbus Day, please back efforts in your local area to try to make it Indigenous Peoples Day, whether it's in your city or in your state. It depends on who is able to do that. There's a lot of places that can only have it by
proclamation.
A proclamation by the mayor. Columbus Day is still a federal holiday, so we have to get more cities and states behind it in order to kind of attack the larger federal holiday at the end of it. But as we move on at the same time that Americans are celebrating Columbus Day, there is the tradition of Canadian Thanksgiving. That's our next topic. I decided to make this episode about the Indigenous experience in all of North America, which does include Canada, and a lot of Americans don't even know that Canadians have a Thanksgiving. But stories vary widely about it.
September, isn't it?
It's at the beginning of October. But yeah, we extra have to ignore it right now that we have the data on the huge spike in COVID spread across Canada following Canadian Thanksgiving. If we acknowledge that Canadian Thanksgiving exists, then we can't take Ted Cruz's turkey away. So we got to keep pretending it's not real. And so tell us about this made-up holiday of Canadian Thanksgiving.
They all are. All of them are.
Yeah,
okay.
All of them. Yeah.
When it comes to Canadian Thanksgiving, for the Americans who are unaware, and it turns out there are a lot of Canadians who are unaware of the mythology behind it as well, because stories actually vary widely. There's several historical stories as to how Canadian Thanksgiving happened.
It was very hard to pin down.
Yeah, we had to do a lot of research for this one, because even though some of our people are from Canada, none of us grew up there. So
right.
Some cite the celebratory meal held by Martin Frobisher.
Yeah.
Whatever that guy is. Some guy arrived
some colonizer
in 1578, but since that involved tinned beef and mushy peas, that's probably not the origin of Canadian Thanksgiving. The next one that people point to is the celebration hosted by Samuel de Champlain in Port Royal on November 14th, 1606. Which saw Europeans and Indigenous peoples breaking bread together. It was organized as part of the Order of Good Cheer dinner party series that was invented to make sure the colonists ate and drank enough to stave off scurvy and malnutrition. There's a very pertinent point of this. It's possible that the only reason any settlers even survived at all was owing to the help of the Micmac, who had taught them ice fishing techniques and introduced them to vital non-toxic berry rich in vitamin C. Don't forget that while I'm talking about this, there is a Micmac fisher problem going on in Nova Scotia.
Which could take up its whole own episode.
Honestly, yeah. So
lucky for you guys, Nova Scotia is not in the Southeast United States. So as of right now, we're not doing that episode.
However,
also everything I know about the Micmacs is like from the low-key racist parts of Anne of Green Gables. So please keep going.
So, what's going on with the Micmac right now, and as quick a way as I can say it, is that that area of Canada is well known for its lobster fishing.
Is this the thing where the vegans are trying to say that they're quote unquote genociding the lobsters? Because we just had a conversation about that in the group chat.
I mean, it's part of it.
It's part of it.
It wasn't the vegans who were firebombing.
The thing that I said
about
it, which was the whole genocide lobster into my face. But go on.
It wasn't the vegans who were firebombing the Indigenous people. So I'm going to finish
Jesus
this.
fucking Christ.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the settlers have a set amount of lobster tags that they can use through the year, and they only have a specific season. The Indigenous people were given a very, very small amount of tags I think it's like 25 or something like that, compared to literally like 100,000, in order to do subsistence fishing for themselves. Because for the Micmac, you don't need a season to fish for lobster, because they fish for lobster sustainably, which means that you could fish it all year because you're not clearing out all of the lobster at once. So the indigenous people were given these tags. This is based on a treaty that is a couple hundred years old at this point, that they were going to be given fishing rights to do subsistence fishing. The lobster fishermen said that because the Micmac were fishing out of season, that they were killing off all the lobster, that the commercial lobster fishermen weren't going to have anything to fish later, that there is a reason for having a season for fishing lobster. And this eventually culminated in settler fishermen going out and cutting lobster traps, pulling up indigenous lobster traps. And at one point, the lobster were put into a warehouse. The Micmac catch was put into a warehouse. Somebody came in and dumped paint thinner on all of the live lobsters in there, which killed most of them and made all of them unedible. And eventually, I think it was like the same day or the next day, somebody went and firebombed the warehouse and the van of the people who were working in the warehouse.
What
so
the fuck?
It's true. I've watched it going down.
When they're also barring like making a physical barrier with their boats or something to
Yes.
stop indigenous fishermen from
And
going out.
it happened several times, like over several days. They would line up their boats to stop the indigenous
people.
lobster fishermen from going out there. So when you think of the Canadian Thanksgiving, if in fact that the story is built on this story of the Micmac teaching them how to survive, they're genuinely flipping that right now. And this happened this year. This happened just a few weeks ago.
Yep.
So
fuck's sake.
Yeah,
that was how we kicked off our fall.
Yeah.
But did you hear how they got revenge though? They apparently, I heard this. I don't know if y'all are going to talk about what just happened, but apparently a few days ago, it turns out that the tribe ended up buying the company.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
now, yeah. Y'all want to talk about that real quick? It's the greatest fucking revenge ever.
Yeah, they didn't buy the whole thing, but they bought a large interest in it. Yeah,
they bought like half the interest in the largest lobster exporters in Nova Scotia. So now,
is it at least a control? Is it controlling shares
Yes.
or just
they are the bosses now? They're
That's
the bosses
hysterical.
now. These fishermen.
That's fucking hysterical.
I know, it's like petty on 1,000. I love it.
Honestly, and there was other ways in which lobster restaurants or restaurants that were selling lobster refused to buy anything coming in from the settler fishermen and would only buy indigenous caught lobsters. This all went down in the matter of, I would say, like 3 weeks or 2 weeks. So
that's real allyship also, like
Yes.
putting their money where their mouth is.
So quite like American Thanksgiving, it's all built on these kind of myths that go together and coming up with a quote unquote good enough reason to have these things, but it's also like a country building exercise. So there's theories that Canadian Thanksgiving, which didn't really come about until the middle of the 19th century as a holiday, is part of the country building exercise of making Canada a thing, because Canada is quite young. So they wanted
is that before or after U.S. Thanksgiving? Because I know U.S. Thanksgiving didn't come about until it was like, oh, we need a thing for everybody to do together to reunite the North and South.
I think it was after, and really what all of that does is those stories kind of culminate into this tradition, and traditions are the cornerstone. They galvanize a national identity, and so it helps you think of yourself as Canadian. And it also helps make them feel absolved of just like the Thanksgiving here. It makes them feel absolved of all of the violence that their ancestors committed to, for them to sit on that land and have that dinner. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So it says in my notes here that the first kind of call for Thanksgiving to be made a thing is in 1865. So it would put it right at the same time that American Thanksgiving was kind of becoming a thing. And it makes a lot of sense in exactly what Ava said, that it's trying to build this national identity. But I just wanted to make sure that we touched on Canadian Thanksgiving, because this is an entire continent episode. So after that, we come to Halloween, and I specifically would like to have Ava talk about appropriation of a specific holiday. Please go ahead.
So a lot of people don't really think about this, but But cultural appropriation of indigenous cultures, in particular, it spans beyond Canada, beyond the US, because as we know, the Americas encompasses also Mexico, everywhere in Central America and South America. So as you can imagine, on a holiday where you get to dress up as anything you want, and white people with their sticky fingers wanting to take everything, everything that's pretty, they have really latched onto this idea of adopting their own styles of like Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. And although the Day of the Dead has a lot of Catholic overtone due to colonizers coming in and kind of mixing up with indigenous people and those traditions, that they go down the line and they kind of come together, and there's a little bit of everything in there. Fundamentally, the holiday is an indigenous holiday. And when we're walking down the street and we're seeing like people dressed up in sugar skulls, because that's so I don't know if you guys know, but I live in deep South Texas, like right on the Mexican border. I live 5 minutes from the Mexican border. And so everyone here where I am, they're Mexican. They're either born in Mexico or they're like first, second generation Mexican. And that's literally about 90% of the population here. So it's not as big of an issue here where I am, because usually when people here are dressed up as it's because they are indigenous Mexican and they're allowed. But I'm actually from the north, like Kiaza. I'm not originally from the southern states. And seeing this all the time was really distressing. So I don't know if you know what the Day of the Dead is about, or all of the symbology that goes into it, but it requires, like any other indigenous tradition, a lot of understanding of the core fundamental parts of the culture that it's born from in order to really comprehend what it is, what it's saying. It's not just an aesthetic. However, to white people who don't have any cultural understanding of anything they've stolen, they just think, oh, it's pretty and it's mine, right? And so you get them just like the Pocahontas costumes or whatever you see in the store. You're just as likely to see sugar skulls and all of this stuff. And it's not just costumes; you'll see it on, tableware, and
there's a whole
like
section at Michael's of decorations for Dia de los
exactly.
Muertos. Yeah.
And people have this habit. They have this habit of separating, and I think we might talk about this just a little bit later. They have this habit of separating Mexicans as a kind of separate thing from Native Americans as they know them in the US. But in fact, we're actually cousins. And we had established trade routes all the way from, honestly, South Guatemala, the middle of Mexico, all the way up into New Mexico, Colorado, those kind of places. Like even today, you can still find jars full of hot chocolate that were gifted to the Hopi by the Nawa people that came up those trade routes. So we have a long history of like intertribal marriages, trading, all of this stuff. So we're not separate people. There's an imaginary border between us, but we're not separate people. And so when you're seeing all this stuff of Mexican culture being appropriated, what you're really seeing is an extension of indigenous cultures being appropriated. And this really feeds into things like xenophobia, but like with the border issue, it's hard to call it xenophobia because Mexicans are not foreign. This is actually their land. Texas used to be part of Mexico, for instance. But it is this like fear of people from the outside coming in and doing effectively what colonizers already did.
Who is that? Who is that friend?
That's Josie.
Hi, Josie.
I have two dogs. I have a shepherd, I think a shepherd papillion mix and like a chihuahua papillion mix, and they are adorbs. They're keeping me company while I do this, because they're like, I see your stress levels are about to spike. Emotional support dog, activate.
So there's a lot of issues that come from kind of the Halloween commercialization as a whole, including Dia de los Muertos. Kind of in the last few years, it's happened a lot, and not only is stealing that aesthetic part of Halloween incorrect, because Dia de los Muertos is not the same as Halloween as a holiday to begin with. You also see issues of things like the Pocahontas costumes, chief costumes, brave costumes.
Roll back. Did you say Pocahontas?
Yes.
It's called Pocahontas. It's a stereotyped Halloween aesthetic. It's anything where they dress up as what they call, well, you know,
It's pick a thing but make it slutty, and then
Exactly.
then they pund it.
Well, it fits into this stereotype of Native women. You could call it and I hate using this word out loud, so like I would normally asterisk this if I was typing it, but the squaw stereotype, right? The idea of this subservient Native woman who is attractive to white men, and so you have these costumes which are, slutty. They're meant to be, very exposing, very like sexual, and the problem with that, and again, this is something we're going to get into later, is how that feeds into the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
It honestly does. So I have worked in, those pop-up Halloween shops that come up in like September. I've worked in those before, and I worked on the counters where they had these Pocahontas costumes. There's several kinds. You can have Southern Pocahontas, you can have Alaskan Pocahontas, you can have Plains Pocahontas. None of them are anything close to what these cultures are actually like, but it continues in what I would call the forced sexualization of Indigenous women. When I say that, there's a point to it. It's that for Indigenous people, when we are at our most decolonized, sexuality is not a bad thing. It's much freer than what you would find from settler ideas. But the way that it's committed is that it's a forced sexualization of these people. Hi, Josie.
It's like a commodifying. Like, it's not just that it's a forced sexualization, because the problem is really that it extends from that colonizer thing where they take a resource and turn it for profit. So in other words, these things are happening for the benefit of the colonizer. And in this case, what they're doing is they're taking their very rough stereotypical ideas of what an Indigenous woman is. They're creating this amalgamate of it in these aesthetic costumes, and they're doing it to feed their own pleasure at like looking at these stereotypes for their own pleasure. Like, it's gross. To me, it's very perverted. But it creates a much larger problem for our communities when we're talking about how that sexualization of Indigenous women by particularly white settler men, it feeds into this violence of I mean, we're going to talk about this later, but there's literal like thousands and thousands and thousands of missing women who are predominantly kidnapped, murdered, and raped by white settler men.
Right. So I can go ahead and get into that now. The Pocahontas and the forced sexualization of Indigenous women is undeniably part of the missing and murdered Indigenous women problem that has come out in the past few years. You can follow hashtags MMIW. Sometimes people use MMIWG2 for girls and two spirits included. Missing and murdered Indigenous people, so with a P at the end. But there's a huge problem going on throughout the Americas of Indigenous women, also including girls and two-spirit folks, who face high rates of sexual assault. Up to 1 in 3 Indigenous women in the United States will be victim to some kind of sexual assault. I have other statistics, including the murder rate. The murder rate of Indigenous women is 10 times higher than the national average. In the U.S. right now, the known number, which is going to be a fraction of the amount of actual people, but the known number of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the U.S. is 5,712. Overwhelmingly, the crimes are committed by non-Indigenous people. One of the ways that is committed, it actually ties into the whole issue of like the tar sands in Canada and pipelines that come through Canada or from the Gulf of Mexico, is that they have things called man camps, which is where men who were hired to work on these pipelines or on the in the tar sands, they build camps for them, for the men to live in. And these men, what you'll find is that once these men take residence in these camps, Indigenous women in the surrounding area will start to disappear, because those men are taking advantage of who they see as a low priority human being, because the cops don't care, the local white people don't care if these Indigenous women go missing. Homicide is one of the leading causes of death for young Indigenous women. The third highest cause of death for ages 10 to 24, and the fifth for ages 25 to 44. That's astounding if you look at death statistics. That for most,
especially like if you compare it to like it's so glaring that you highlighted that the majority of these crimes are committed by non-indigenous people, because it just harkens into like it ties into the mythology of black on black crime, in that like, what about black on black crime? Well, yeah, well, what about because in other ethnicities, you do see the majority, like, yeah, black people are more likely to commit crimes against black people due to de facto segregation. And that's why, if you look at crimes in which white people are the victims, they're most likely and statistically, committed by white people. So this is outside the norm
exactly,
for
Right,
that
and
to be the
it
case.
has a lot
And
to do with
that's glaring.
it has a lot to do with jurisdictions and kind of like issues of when you're talking about who has power to prosecute crimes on off indigenous lands, when you're talking about status Indians especially. So it has a lot to do with that. Also, when Kiaza mentioned adding the P at the end, I just wanted to take a moment. It's not in the notes, but I wanted to highlight that part of the reason that the P is included, because I know men tend to usurp conversations when we're talking about women, but it's really, really important to note that Indigenous men also have a very high rate of like violence, in particular being brutalized and murdered by police. Natives are actually the most likely racial group by population ratio to be brutalized by police. And so it's really important. Yes, we have this conversation particularly about women because it is an absolutely out of control issue. But we also need to remember that Indigenous women are not the only ones affected. There's the girls, the Two-Spirit, and the men and boys that are also going missing, being murdered, or being abused or raped.
exactly. And this often, I'm not gonna try to argue either side right now, but this often comes up in conversations where we're talking about sex workers' safety versus human trafficking. Um, that Indigenous people can be a sex worker if they decide to, but a lot of the times the young women and the young girls who end up being missing or end up murdered end up being sex trafficked as well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and those issues will come against each other a lot of times, because if you try to push well, we need to focus on sex trafficking because it's not happening to many in the population outside of Indigenous people, it seems like it's derailing the conversation, when actually it's just a very specialized part of it that we need more people to be aware of. There's also like stats in Canada that status Indian women and girls between the ages of 10 and 44 have mortality rates that are 3 to 4 times higher than those of females in the general population. And status girls aged 15 to 19 are 5 times more likely to die than non-status Canadians. Status being that they are what we would call a federally recognized Indian. So they are called status in Canada. In Canada as well, there's more than 1,181 missing women cited since 1980, and that's from an RCMP report in 2014. So that's the police saying this is how many we have missing, when in reality
Right.
there's way more. And that's also
And
folds into the issue with the border and people migrating from Central America, from Mexico, that Ava can hit for me.
right, so we need to think of this, yeah, again, United States and Canada together having basically 7,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women that are reported is such a large number, but it really becomes mind-boggling, utterly mind-boggling, when you think that that does not include statistics for Mexico, Central America, South America, because these are also Indigenous women that are going missing frequently from, the cartel, perhaps coyotes, traffickers. The logging business in South America is especially bad, that kind of thing. So when we include all of those numbers, we could be looking at several tens of thousands minimum. That's reported, you know what I mean? And unreported, I mean, unreported, it could honestly be so much higher. 100,000 would not even surprise me.
Yeah,
So it's
there's stories of a place in Canada called the Highway of Tears, I think, where
Yes.
it's kind of colloquially known that Indigenous women who are around there will go missing, and there's thoughts that there's a serial killer out there, but it's not the way that you would hear about like a serial killer in the US, that it gets a whole lot of attention and that these cases are being focused on quite heavily because of all the true crime nerds that are out there. But it's this place in Canada where Indigenous women go missing, so nobody cares. But we all know that it's there.
Right, and it's flat out largely because the police don't care, and they have told Indigenous people as much. When they come and they beg for their family to be found, they are literally told, well, she deserved it. She was Indian. You know what I mean? She was probably drunk. She was asking for it. She was probably a sex worker, all of these things. And so when we're talking about these cases, they have literally gone cold due to apathy. And so we're really talking about something that's, honestly, for any person, it is mind-boggling. The thing about the serial killer, he's not going to be the only one. There's definitely, that particular road that she's mentioning in Canada, but there's similar frequent disappearances on highways in the US. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So it's basically, you could say almost that native land, or these large rural spaces in between where Indigenous people exist, are like playgrounds for serial killers because nobody will care to look. Most Indigenous women who go missing that are found, they're not found by police. They're found by the community, which has organized their own searches long past, the police saying we're done. So
That's happened in several of the highest profile cases in the past few years. It's the missing and murdered Indigenous women thing is one of my pet issues. So I've been following several cases, and most of the high profile cases, so I'm talking about Olivia Lone Bear, Tina Fontaine in Canada, Misty Upham she was either in Washington State or Oregon, and Savannah Greywind. These people who were murdered, they end up being found dead. None of them were found by police efforts. All of them were found by community efforts, because the police, if they search at all, they'll search for a couple days and give up on it. And sometimes they just don't search at all. So the communities, their families will get together and say, please help me find this person. So all of those cases were found by members of the community because the police just don't care. And when it came to like Savannah Greywind, this is going to be quite upsetting for talk of pregnancy and injury that comes from it. So if you have an issue, please
trigger warning.
Skip forward a couple minutes. But Savannah Greywind was like in her apartment, they found a lot of blood and they knew that she was 8 months pregnant. So in most cases, if a pregnant woman was presumed to be injured, especially if she was white, if a white pregnant woman was presumed to be injured, there would be huge, massive outpouring of grief. People would be searching forever. And it turns out that she was murdered and cut open for the baby, who was found alive but cut open by the murderers, and they took the baby. And to believe that she, of all people, had to be found by a community effort is just, it blows my mind that this is the amount of apathy that people can have towards Indigenous women when it comes to this kind of thing.
Which is why when settler allies ask what they can do to help, more than like petitioning your local government or petitioning the police to help, because honestly, that's probably going to fall on deaf ears. The most effective thing you can do if you live in an area where this is an issue is to physically get on the ground and join these manhunts, because the sooner that the bodies are brought home, the sooner the family can have closure. And I would honestly say that while we should always be fighting for justice and trying to get the government to care, to hold these people, these murderers accountable, I think on some level, Indigenous people have understood that this is a very far off dream for us. And what ultimately in the immediate moment matters is the family knowing what happened. So get on the ground. If you know that there's searches in your area for a Native woman who has gone missing, please join. Please help find her and bring her home to her family.
So I think we should probably move off of the more heavy subjects, and we can move on to what it's like to be Indigenous during Native American Heritage Month. That Native American Heritage Month was approved by President George H.W. Bush in 1990 as a joint resolution designating November 1990 Native American Indian Heritage Month. Similar proclamations under variants on the name, including Native American Heritage Month and National American Indian and Alaska Native Heritage Month have been issued each year since 1994. So I want you to understand that these heritage months have only existed within my lifetime, within Ava's lifetime, with I assume most of the people listening's lifetime.
And they're not permanent. They're proclamations that have to be made. So
when it comes to Native American Heritage Month, or whatever names that they're using, what you would kind of expect is that people other than Indigenous people are finally going to be talking about Indigenous issues, and that turns out not to be the case. Or if it is
Not
the
at
case,
all.
it's not fun for us, because it usually means that our labor, our burden of labor is increased so much because so many settlers are talking about things that they don't have complete information on, that they have a benefit in hiding what the actual history was and only talking about the good things. So it's a very fraught month for us, and Ava and I have already discussed how much our workload has increased since November began, even though this is quite a quiet Native American Heritage Month because everybody's at home. But I do want to bring up last year, Donald Trump also proclaimed November 2019 as National American History and Founders Month to celebrate the first European founders and colonizers of America. In a similar fashion, on October 13th, 2019, President Donald Trump issued a formal proclamation recognizing Columbus Day and not Indigenous Peoples Day. So it's pretty clear that Donald Trump was courting white supremacists with calling November 2019 Founders Month, or European Founders Month, because it's so easy to just say, oh, well, the natives have their 1 month where they get to be interesting. But no, we're going to make sure that this is kind of like if there's International Women's Day, how come there's not International Men's Day? It only comes up when somebody else is having the spotlight. So
what about a White History Month?
Honestly, and they got it.
Well, that's basically what this is, right? That's what a day celebrating colonizers or a month celebrating colonizers is. It's basically saying, but what about white people too?
Exactly. So with these kinds of things, I specifically want to talk about some of my memories from when I was in school. My mom would come into my school when I was quite young, so when I was still in elementary school, to do guest spots in my class or in several classes at a time to explain Indigenous issues by herself so that she didn't have to trust any white teachers, because I went to a very white school district. She didn't have to trust any white teachers to explain Indigenous Heritage Month, do any storytelling, doing any crafts with the kids, talking about Thanksgiving, because of course it happens during the same month. So I want to be clear that this dramatically increases the burden of work on Indigenous people, especially the Indigenous people that you might know, because we're in these discussions, and I've had several discussions this month already where people are missing the point, or they think they have the history correct. I would like you guys to think about reading for comprehension. Just read for comprehension to understand what the history is, and then go out and attempt it, because there is so much work that we've had to do in the past few weeks.
Just for this brief thing, like, this isn't even the tip of the iceberg. Like, the amount of knowledge it really requires to understand the core issues, the catalyst that began all this, the after effects, what we're dealing with now, like this whole thing. A mastery of this could take a lifetime, honestly, and talking about it could take just as long. So
yeah, and there's one other thing, because this section is quite short, that I would like to point out that we can discuss right now, is that the title of the month, especially beginning in the 90s, was National American Indian Heritage Month, and we get a lot of questions. What do we actually call you people? So it's not as fraught as you think. Chances are, if you know somebody who comes under one of these titles, just ask them. It's polite. You can ask them and they'll tell you their tribe. A lot of people would rather be called by their tribe, so I wouldn't necessarily be a Native American. I would be Mohawk and Comanche. And there's other people who prefer Indigenous. There's other people who prefer Indian. There's other people who prefer Native American. There's
varying reasons for this.
Yes,
like,
there's changes in terminology every few years. So chances are you might meet an older person who is fine with being called an Indian, whereas somebody like me, I only allow people to call me an Indian if they know me like a sibling, basically.
Right. And for me, it's very similar. Like for instance, there's no real safe terms. I've heard like settlers ask, like, isn't there a general term I can basically use for all of you people? But the fact is that like I once thought that indigenous was kind of that, but like indigenous isn't particular to Native Americans. Like there are other indigenous people like the Sami, like Pacific Islanders who are technically indigenous, but not Native American. So they're not actually synonymous terms. They overlap, but they're not synonymous. And there are people who feel that terms like this, like indigenous or just native, are too broad. They paint us with too large of a stroke, which in some conversations or some contexts is useful. When we're talking about a shared experience, the experience between the Pacific Islanders and the Native Americans is very similar. So for me, that term becomes most useful when we're talking about those shared experiences. But you also have ones that like don't want to be called Native American because they will never identify as American, period. And First Nations, that's particular to Canada. I have seen some natives kind of broad stroke all of us as First Nations, but then again, some have a problem with that also. So you're never going to find one comfortable term you can always use. Like Kiaza said, it's just best to the natives in your life to just ask what they like to be called and to just use that around them. And just always ask before doing it, because you never know. You never know. I do know, I have even younger friends, people who aren't older, but they still prefer the term Indian, even though they're a younger generation. And they have very specific reasons for that they'll argue. And if that's what they want to be called, that's what they should be called, if that's what they're asking. But that does not give you permission to call all of us Indians. You know what I mean? So
there's one thing that I would like to point out with this is that if a settler is asking you, oh, is there one safe thing to call you guys? Our job is not to make you comfortable. You should be uncomfortable with what you call us. So
yes.
Just deal with it. Okay, moving on to the Thanksgiving, the big one.
The big one.
So, before 1616, so before the first quote unquote recorded Thanksgiving, the Wampanoag, who are the indigenous people who were primarily involved in this, numbered 50,000 to 100,000, occupying about 69 villages scattered throughout southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island. The plague brought by Europeans, brought by Eurasian diseases, killed thousands, up to 2/3 of them, and many had also been captured and sold as slaves. So that's your before Thanksgiving. A lot of people like to bring up the story of Squanto, also known as Tisquantum, who was a Wampanoag who befriended and helped the English that spring, showing them how to plant corn, fish, and gather berries and nuts. That March, the Pilgrims entered into a treaty of mutual protection with the Pokanoket Wampanoag leader. So then we get to 1621, which is the year of the first recorded Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims went out with their guns to hunt after their first good harvest, so this was in fact in the fall. The Wampanoag heard the gunfire and assumed that meant that their allies, after the treaty, were being attacked, and sent around 90 warriors out to aid the people who they thought were being attacked. When they found out that it was just a bunch of white people causing a hoopla, the Pilgrims invited the chief and the 90 warriors who came out to the feast once they showed up, but there was not enough food. So yet again, the Wampanoag went out and harvested 5 deer, which they presented as a ceremonial gift to the leader of the Pilgrims.
And which they did with a lot of hesitation. Like, it wasn't like they were all happy to invite, some Indians over. Like, you could almost say we almost invited ourselves, and they probably felt obligated to let us be there, as we have a habit of doing. Do you want me to get the next part?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, trigger warning, this is a little bit violent. This recounts kind of the catalyst for the Pequot War. And it has not super graphic. I'll try not to be super graphic, but it can be disturbing. In 1637, in retaliation for the murder of a trader that settlers believed the Pequot natives had killed, colonists and their allies surrounded a nearby Pequot fort near the Mystic River and set it, including the longhouse which was housing the families, on fire, and proceeded to shoot many of them as they came out, running out to see what was happening, along with any that attempted to escape over the palisades into the nearby woods. The city was, since it was a fort, it was surrounded by walls. So as they were climbing the walls, they were shot, and they were shot in the back if they started running toward the woods. In total, the massacre claimed somewhere between 500 and 700 men, women, and children. That's the entire population of the village at the time, excluding a small band of raiders who were already outside of the fort at the time. Those would be the only survivors. This event was a catalyst. It erupted into a string of similar events, which became known as the Pequot War, with many other villages also being raided in a similar fashion, and with Native girls younger than 14 routinely being rounded up and sold into slavery.
So that, even though it doesn't seem like it ties into the first Thanksgiving, this does in fact lead on, because following this mass murder, William Bradford, who was the governor of Plymouth and who was the leader that was presented with the 5 deer at the first Thanksgiving, wrote that for the next 100 years, every Thanksgiving day ordained by a governor was in honor of the bloody victory, thanking God that the battle had been won. So even though the first few years of Thanksgiving, if it was a yearly reoccurring thing, there's not a whole lot saying that this was a yearly reoccurring thing. But from then on, from 1637 on, Thanksgiving was specifically to be celebrated that because the settlers had killed almost the entire Pequot Nation. In fact, there's a museum in Connecticut about the Pequot War, and it was assumed that the entire nation of Pequots had been murdered at this time, but as it turns out, a very small amount survived. You can see why they wouldn't want to come out. But
Right.
there is still some Pequots that exist, but it was thought for a long time that at this time they had murdered the entire Pequot Nation. So because this was such a bloody thing that they decided this is what we're going to celebrate, as a tradition, at noon on every Thanksgiving Day, hundreds of Native people from around the country gather at Coles Hill, which overlooks Plymouth Rock, on the National Day of Mourning. It's an annual tradition started in 1970 when Wampanoag Wamsutta Frank James was invited by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to give a speech at the event celebrating the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims' arrival. And then he was disinvited after the event organizers discovered his speech was one of outrage over the atrocities and broken promises his people had endured. So AIM has no chill. If you invite somebody from AIM, they are going to read you exactly what happens. So this all kind of goes along with, as I said, the American mythology is very powerful. So the whole idea of as soon as it became disadvantageous to Americans to think about murdering an entire nation, it became about, but it's friendship with the Indians. So that's really
This is why Friendsgiving is not an acceptable alternate name for Thanksgiving.
It's not funny. Like, it's not funny, but it's so absurd
that it's completely flipped. So honestly, I would assume that most people that are listening to this have thought about what the actual history of Thanksgiving is, but it's very important to confront it head on, because we need to think about how we talk about Thanksgiving to children in school with their like paper bag Indians. Like, I specifically remember this. I went to school in the 90s and I remember being given
the grocery sack punji vest.
Yes,
the
exactly.
grocery sack.
And making like the
I had a friend whose
headbands.
child had to do it last year, and I was like, "Ma'am, what the fuck is this?" Like, no, it's still happening.
Yeah, I mean, and in lots of places, like I've seen several pictures this year of like, you need to call this school because they're still doing it's a very nice thing, and the Pilgrims and the Indians ate together, and we're gonna do like a school play for it and everything. So
honestly though, like on the topic of children, like they really are like I mean, they're gonna grow up into our warriors and those who like are guardians for the culture. My kid in particular, Kai knows this. My kid in particular has a rough time at school because of this kind of thing. Even down here where people are primarily indigenous, they are still descendants disenfranchised from their mother culture by colonization. And so they tend to think of themselves as very white, even though they would never actually pass off as that. So even in her school, which is, predominantly has people of color, particularly of indigenous descent, there's still this misinformation being fed to these children about their own origins. And recently, recently, I mean, it's actually happened a couple times in the last year. Recently, though, the English teacher had an assignment about basically explaining what you're thankful for, what you're going to do on Thanksgiving, all of this stuff. And she said, well, if you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, you can still write an essay on what you're grateful for. And my child came marching into the room and said, Mom, I don't want to do this assignment. I want to do an essay on what Thanksgiving really is. And this 11-year-old child sat down in front of the computer and wrote a page essay in the briefest, I mean, you can see how long this is taking us. So it's the briefest terms. It's only a page long, about how things really started in their own words. And that was what they submitted as their assignment. They don't want to feel pressured by their school to participate in this giant lie. So it's not only my work that increases during this holiday season, it is also the work of an 11-year-old who should be busy being a kid, who has to constantly correct teachers, fellow students, and friends about these misconceptions. There was actually an incident last year with the music class where they were singing a holiday song praising the colonization of Jamestown. And my child came home totally beside themselves, absolutely disbelieving that they had to sing this for a concert. And so my child decided to opt out of that concert. But what they ended up doing was putting on their ribbon skirt, painting their face, and they went to the concert with a shirt that said Columbus was a murderer written across it. And
that is awesome.
Needless to say, the class was quite shocked. But basically, they said that Zan could still participate if they turned their shirt inside out. My child said no, and if they wouldn't let them wear the shirt on stage, they were not going to perform, and they did that at the possible expense of their own grade. So I just want to point out that the children are also doing the work, and this is an undue burden on Indigenous kids that really they shouldn't have to. But who else is going to do the work in their school? We can't, as parents, we can't, be parroting over their shoulder all the time. We can't be helicopter parroting in their schools, and so they have to take on this work, and it's immense, and it's not fair to them at all.
Like I've talked about this with you guys before, possibly, but I remember the first time having to correct some settler bullshit in school when I was, I think 7. So it starts young. If Indigenous parents are teaching their kids the history that we have learned ourselves, they end up taking on this burden. So I remember being a quote unquote activist from the age of 7. I never had a chance not to be.
Same.
And Ava had the same, and their kid is doing the same, and this keeps happening over and over again. And it makes us good advocates for ourselves, and we're very smart, and we do a lot of thinking on this. But what about all the times when you just want to relax as a kid and just do kid things and take part in the lessons that are in your school? So this is something we're doing a disservice to these kids by teaching them this incorrect history, because a lot of teachers will end up not even being aware that they have an Indigenous kid in class. I remember this all the way through high school, that I had teachers that weren't even aware that I was Indigenous. So I would end up being the subject of racism against Indigenous people and having to call it out in front of my peers as a 16-year-old. That is terrifying.
This happened to me. This actually happened to me when I was 5 or 6, because actually I might have been a little older, maybe 6, 7. I was in maybe first, second grade, maybe. I don't really remember. It was really young. I had just started school, and we had to do some kind of very brief genealogy or whatever for some kind of project. And I had to point out that basically we didn't have a solid record of our family because of all the colonization that happens to Indigenous people, and that I might not even been comfortable sharing parts of my culture in front of kids that were not anything like me. So this teacher basically tried to call me a liar, called my dad to get him to stop me from making up fibs about being Native. My dad had to then correct her, and he actually followed up about 3 days later when he had the time. He came into the school in full regalia to correct her in person. So my very first experiences in school were having people dismiss me, dismiss my culture, and dismiss the damage that has been done to our families and our very broken frequently very broken like ideas of like where everything has come from, or where it's all ended up, due to, you know, again, missing and murdered Indigenous women, adoptions, you know, things like that. So it was just like a very, very sobering thing for me. And as a kid, like Kai said, it was like that moment where I realized I was going to be doing this the rest of my life. I was never going to go through school and not have this happen. And as it turns out, just like Kai, I was doing this all the way into high school. I never actually went to college, but I know I would be doing it there if I had. So it's the same thing.
And just to follow on from that, there's this idea that Indigenous people are just like buzzkills when it comes to Thanksgiving, and that
how dare you?
The only thing we want to do is wipe it out. And yes, I do. I would indeed like to walk into your house and tell your Nana to throw that turkey away.
That's actually, that answers. So I had like a final question to wrap all of it up. Is that like, is there a way to keep the holiday while correcting the narrative?
No.
Is that even possible?
No, absolutely not.
And there's reasons for this. You know, honestly, I think we actually have some notes here on it, on what we kind of think of this. But a lot of people try watering it down by calling it Friendsgiving, celebrating it on a different day, but basically changing nothing fundamental about it at all. And we have, you know, like married in family or whatever that sometimes feel awkward whether or not they should invite us to Thanksgiving, all of this stuff. So this is something that we have to navigate every single year. My mother-in-law really struggled with figuring out whether or not she should invite me for Thanksgiving, because she wanted to see her family, obviously, and I understand that. But she knew that I have no chill. And so we had a very frank conversation about it. And she said, basically, like, what do I have to do to get you to be a part of this thing, whatever it ends up being? What do I have to do to make this happen? And I told her, you know what? It's not like we don't like food. Kai and I will tell you, we love turkey and potatoes and pumpkin more than literally anyone else in the planet.
Delicious.
Yeah.
We
so it's not like we're saying
like weird like white people Jello salads as part of your Thanksgiving meal. Like, I mean,
it's not like we're saying that you can't have these things or like have a dinner with your family. We're not saying that you can't have, you know, a harvest festival meal that you share with your kin. Like that's ingrained in Indigenous people way before colonizers ever came. You know what I mean? So it's not like you can't have those things, but the problem is when you're just reinventing the same holiday but with a different name on a different date, or the thing is that sometimes you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater when the baby is genocide. Like sometimes you just have to get rid of the whole thing and start from scratch. And that's where we really are sitting. For now, though, navigating these situations, because we have not done that, has, you know, it's very gray for a lot of us. So I really do want to spend time with my family. So what I told her was, look, I will come to your dinner, but I have demands. And among those were that we were going to use the day as a platform to highlight and discuss Indigenous issues, with them understanding that they were colonizers. Her in particular, she was white. The husband is not. That's my husband's dad. And so we would do things like she would ask my youngest, and again, this ends up culminating in more work for us. But I would rather them listen than just not celebrate the holiday and also not think about why they're not celebrating the holiday. So asking my child, for instance, to write a little report that they could share with the family about how our area in particular, the Rio Grande Valley, was originally colonized by the Spanish. And so I said, okay, so there has to be some level of education going on that day. I said, if you want me to bring food, I am not going to bring you, a green bean casserole. I'm going to bring an Indigenous dish of some sort. So I've done like boiled cornbread and that kind of thing. I've made rosapi. Yeah. And
if
so
you have some dope Indigenous recipes, will you send them to us, and will we be allowed to include them in the cookbook?
I mean, honestly, I usually do. I don't really think I have a recipe because I do it from memory, but I could probably help find some that are approximately the same as what I've made.
Well,
if you just want to rate what you do,
the contract later on.
Yeah, the contract. Yeah,
we don't give this shit away for free.
I just feel like
we don't give this shit away for free.
These our good white people listeners would really love some of your delicious foods. So like, that would be really fun to be able to include that and share that, so that it's not just all like mine and Tyler's white people cooking.
Right. And so, we've had to have these conversations, and I did. It takes a little give and take in this instance for her to get what she wants, but for me to like, and it always involves,
sorry,
it always involves me settling, you know what I mean? Or it always involves in general Indigenous people settling. I know that Kai's had her own experiences with Thanksgiving as well that are probably not identical to this, but the same kind of muddy gray area. So all in all, like in this case, it's a particular thing when a family member asks you, like, that's fine that we had that exchange. But as a rule, like, because we've been asked this, don't invite your Native friends to Thanksgiving. Like,
it's just good manners at this point. But
yeah, it's like, good manners.
For the record, it's just, Indigenous people are entirely capable, and we have a history of this, of having thankfulness and gratitude built into our society, and to have harvest meals, and to have these foods shared, because sharing food is a social thing and all that. Like, we're not opposed to having a harvest meal and sharing it with our family because we love them and because we want to serve the people who previously served us. But when it comes to Thanksgiving, don't try to whitewash it in order to make it more palatable for non-Indigenous audiences who are uncomfortable with the history of it.
Yeah, you cannot decolonize a holiday where its entire basis is colonization. Like, it's that thing I said, like, you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater when its fundamental part is genocide. Do you know what I mean? That is the baby. It's genocide. So you have to throw it all out and you have to start over. So we need to be having conversations instead about how we can celebrate the fall and how we can celebrate the harvest on an even ground, which is not born from colonization.
Right. So I know that we're getting pressed for time. Nelson, do we have time to do like a couple questions?
Yeah, let's shoot for 5 more minutes, right? So like
Okay.
at 1:15.
We got to wrap.
And then we'll shoot for that. And then actually we don't have anything planned for next week, so if you guys want to come back next week, we can do part 2 to get it kind of back to back. So I think that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah,
sure.
So we can do which question do you want to do, Ava? Which one do you feel like is most...
Well, I did want to address
the 2 good ones that make us feel really guilty.
There's a couple questions here about that we had received about
I did it.
Hold on a second, about like decolonizing specifically, and also about how socialism kind of plays a part, like the question about like how do the twin projects of abolishing the settler colonial state. And I kind of wanted to talk a bit about that. And I think that's honestly good all by itself.
Right. So I asked the listeners in the fan group if they had any questions that they'd like to ask us. So I guess we'll finish on this one. This is the only question I got from the fan group, and I'm going to give you shit about this. Not the guy who questioned me, but because I asked you guys to give me questions because I don't want you to think that you know everything. Ask me questions if you don't know something. This is the only time I'm promising not to give you shit. And because you didn't ask me anything, I'm giving you shit now. So next time, ask me questions. I'm not that mean. So we had one question from a listener by the name of Matt. And his question was, how should we best envision the twin projects of abolishing the settler colonial state and building socialism? What role can settlers play in the process of decolonization and defeating both the settler and comprador bourgeoisie? Ava.
Yeah, so the short answer to that is we don't. We don't. And this is coming from someone, so Kai and I are very much on the left spectrum of politics if you had to put us somewhere. But we're very hesitant to use terms like socialism because they are themselves steeped in colonization to some degree. This is a really big topic, and honestly, we could probably do an entire episode on this in particular. I'll just, at the end of this, I'll leave you with a resource where you guys can learn more if you're interested. But basically the idea is, in order to decolonize something, you can't, it's just like the Thanksgiving thing. You don't decolonize Thanksgiving when its very foundation is colonization. And there can be no dual state of like decolonization and socialism. It can't work that way, because socialism itself is a very Eurocentric idea. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have good points, but a lot of these points, they originally rested in indigenous communities to begin with, which the resource I'll share will go more into that. And in fact, I think Marx specifically mentioned something called what he called primitive communism, which was where he drew some of his ideas from how indigenous societies worked. So we already have these ideas of our own. Decolonizing means getting rid of all of it and replacing it with or building up a state of indigenous sovereignty. So fundamentally, the way I would answer this is what socialists have to do is understand a couple things. They need to understand that their theories are all fine and good. But when we're talking about all of this, sorry, it's a little weird hearing myself echo. When we're talking about all of this, they have to let go of the idea of whatever this twin state this person is talking about. And they have to understand that it's actually in their best interest as well to get behind decolonization as the mother, the mother action of what we need to be doing. And part of this is because the ultimate goal of leftist movements like communism, et cetera, is to topple capitalism. You cannot do that without decolonizing. And when you decolonize, the fall of capitalism will naturally follow. And it will be replaced with communal ideas of sharing, of a shared economy, of all these things that socialists want. So you can enjoy the theory, you can read it, whatever, but you have to understand that like decolonization is a fundamental part of making this happen, and you cannot do it without it. You cannot call yourself a socialist and not get behind decolonization, because if you support that but don't support decolonization, the thing that you want will never happen. It will just never happen, because colonization is the reason capitalism exists. And the resource I was mentioning that will get a lot more into this if you guys are interested in learning more about how intimately these things are tied, about how colonization led to capitalism directly and how it cannot be undone without decolonizing. There's an older documentary, I think it's about 10 years old, and it's called The End of Poverty. You can find it on Prime. And it's basically a bunch of like leftist economists and so on talking about how colonization created capitalism, how it affects indigenous people all over the world, and how the upper class feeds from and profits from the suffering of indigenous people, and how the only way to overcome capitalism is to stop that from happening. So I definitely suggest that you guys check it out.
My answer is yeah, you don't get to build a twin state. There is our state or you leave. That is it. And I'm not
Yep.
I'm kind of joking. I'm not actually joking, because I do believe in full decolonization, full indigenous sovereignty, and importing an idea from the exact like European location that colonized us doesn't appeal to me. And Ava is way more skilled at explaining this. I'm more of the hardline no answer. So
Yeah, like we don't owe you an explanation for this, but basically like it's either get behind us or leave. And sometimes even if you get behind us, you might still have to leave, and you have to be okay with that. That's part of decolonization. You know what I mean?
yeah, we've even had close discussions where we've realized that both of us as disenfranchised natives, because neither of us are claimed by our tribes. There's a whole story behind that. I'm not going to get into it. Because we're disenfranchised natives, if in our fever dream this ended up happening one day and we ended up being on the list of who gets taken out of the country, we would both be fine with that, because for us the goal is indigenous sovereignty. It's not
Right.
about what benefits us, it's what benefits our people.
Right. And we say this, as she's saying, we say this knowing that we may also be subject to being ejected. But when we're talking about this, you need to understand that this comes from a communal perspective, and it's not about what is best for me. It's about what's best for the people. So if that means that Kai and I have to go live in England where she already lives, it's unfortunate. I would never want to leave my homeland. I would never want to leave my people. People, white people want to leave already, and they're like, oh, I'm going to migrate to Europe. And I can't do that, because I will not let this country be taken by fascists. However, if an indigenous state tells me, look, we can't really figure out where you should or shouldn't be, and we just think it's better if you leave, then Kai and I would go. So we know that this very well might include us.
And I think that's all that we
Yeah.
have a whole bunch of questions that we can do next time if you guys decide to have us back next week. But yeah, I think that's the end of it for today.
Right. Well, that was a lot. I learned a lot. Thanks, y'all. I
Are
appreciate
you
it.
feeling pretty guilty?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, good.
I'm gonna go. I'm never gonna drink pumpkin spice latte ever again.
Look, get some pumpkin, get some indigenous squash. It is delicious, my guy.
It's delicious. It's delicious.
You can have potatoes, you can have squash, you can have corn, you can have all kinds of indigenous berries. We got the good shit food, all right?
Deer? Like, who doesn't want to eat deer? It's delicious.
Venison is amazing.
It's amazing. Hey, Kai, my friend actually made fusion pho. So he made pho, but he made it with venison and hominy.
Oh, that sounds delicious.
It looked amazing.
All right,
Hell
guys.
Yeah. All right, y'all. So I'm gonna just do the outro, I guess. We'll just call it a night. At Dixieland the Proletariat, we believe the South will rise again, but this time for the right reasons, those being worker-owned means of production, decolonization, and self-determination for all oppressed peoples. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to us on social media at Dixie Prole. We're coming to you from the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement, Montgomery, Alabama, and the Bluff City, Memphis, Tennessee. We'd also like to recognize we're recording on occupied land. The rightfully belongs to Muskogee and the Chickasaw Nations. Thanks, y'all, for coming on. I learned a lot. I know our fans are going to learn a lot. And, yeah. God, I hate being
I
white.
hope you feel thrashed.
I do. All right, y'all. Till next time.
Bye.